Imagine a world where blood isn't thicker than water, where you can buy a woman at the market and call her your sister, where Dutch men, far from home, have secret black families and live in a castle where black men, women, and children are locked in dungeons, destined to travel across the Atlantic and never return home. This is the West African seaport of Edna. The year is 1744. A royal named Adjoa has been captured into slavery. A strip of gray, the same dirty color as the sky. That's what Adjoa had waited most of her life to see. She'd heard tales about that ocean and the strange foreigners trading there and had always hoped to visit it. Never did she expect to do so on a coffle of war prisoners and others captured or sold into servitude. A muzzle was clamped across her mouth, crushing her lips. She wore a commoner's rough blue cloth. Her feet, accustomed to fine leather sandals, were raw from 2 months of walking barefoot. Her neck strained from the weight of the elephant tusk she carried atop her head. The others on the coffle, chained to each other by the neck, looked just as wretched. They wielded baskets of gold, ivory, and other goods. Adjoa blinked back through the rain running down her cheeks, hating the sensation of tears. Of all things, she didn't dream of arriving to the ocean without her hair. The coffle's guards had spared them nothing, not even their eyebrows or the wiry patches beneath their arms and at their center. Now, staring at that ocean, Adjoa wished for a mouth like her grandmother Nana Essie's to ask the creators why they'd given her this destiny. The others on the coffle had never traveled to the edge of the earth either. They chattered and pointed at the ocean and the large town running alongside it. Pakwesi, the fat fancy leader of the coffle, called that place Edna. Many things down there were strange but too far to make out, such as the yellow brick structure Pakwesi called Castile, the largest building Adjoa had ever seen. As the women around her debated about what it was, Adjoa realized it must have been made by the foreign traders who came from across the ocean. People generally referred to them as brofo, strangers. And I'm excerpting an excerpt. The sight of the Castile up close made Adjoa gasp. It rose beyond the height of 7 tall men. She was amazed that those yellow bricks, no bigger than her feet, could support so much weight. She wondered if the brofo were the giants said to have roamed the earth before humankind existed. Even the white, red, and blue flag flapping at the Castile's pinnacle was enormous. A hush fell over the coffle. Some of them pointed to the Castile's upper deck, where normal-sized men with skin bright like fufu appeared at the square-cut spaces. Another group approached the coffle on foot, walking like people, but dressed in clothes stranger than Pakwesi's, uncomfortable-looking shoes that cover their feet whole, tight white fabric around their lower legs, and breeches and shirts like Pakwesi's. A few had clouds of unbelievable long white hair, but they didn't appear old enough to be elders. Their skin was not like an albino's, but more like roasted pig meat. They all had too much nose, no lips to speak of, and straight hair like a goat's. A barefoot, black-skinned man wearing the same clothes shielded them from the rain with a large red umbrella, as though they were royals. Adjoa and the others watched in awe as those men shook Pakwesi's hand properly, ending in a snap. They could also speak some Mfansi, the language of the coastal people, though with accents like none Adjoa had heard. Pakwesi, Akwaba, they said in welcome. His response, Ginya, sounded odd to Adjoa, even though it was the common reply to one's peers. Adjoa noticed that most of the people in Edna had the right color, blackish brown like a coconut shell, and the proper facial features and hair. If not for their short stature and the fact that some of them wore brofo clothing, Adjoa would have thought that they were neighbors from beyond her home. They strolled in the rain, going about their business as though the sight of a 50-person caravan was normal. In her hometown, the couples passing through fascinated the adults and children alike. They marveled at the wares carried atop the captives' heads and tried to guess their nationhood by their physique and facial cuts. It had been a pastime to them. They'd never considered those people's feelings as their eyes probed them. Now, Adjoa could only feel gratitude that the Edina people ignored her coffle as they trudged by.
Thank you, Kim. Before we start talking more about your piece that you contributed, could you tell us a little bit more about the photos that we're going to see up here?
Okay, so the essay basically talks about a trip that I took. I wanted to see as much of the slavery-related sites in Ghana as possible. And at a town called Salaga, which is towards the middle of the country, there was an old former slave market, and that was the picture. And this was basically taking the canoe across the Volta River of Ghana on the way to that town. This was one of the forts. I think it's Fort St. Anthony and Exim along the coast of Ghana. And it was originally built by the Portuguese and I think taken over by the Dutch. And to give you an idea of these forts and castles, the first one was built at this town, Edina, which is more popularly known as Elmina, which you might have heard of, on the Ghanaian coast. It was built in 1482. And most of these forts were started in the late 1400s, early 1500s. I forget which one this is, but there are numerous. Ghana, the coastline of Ghana had the most of these forts, and basically the African captives like Adjoa would have been imprisoned in these forts and dungeons where they had to wait sometimes upwards of 1 to 3 months before a ship came to take them across the Atlantic. And they waited in horrendous conditions. At one of the forts, one of the really popular ones in Cape Coast, the archaeologists wanted to find the original floor, and they had to dig through about 2 feet of compacted human waste to actually find the stone floor. So they were kept in really horrendous conditions, and you go into the dungeons, and one of the pictures before had a desk was in the dungeon, and I literally fell apart when I saw that, because this is my ancestors who could have gone through this and suffered, and now someone's using it as an office space. But these spaces have also been used as post offices, discos, bars, tribunal courts, because the Ghanaians, some of them at least, have a different relationship to this history, where it wasn't their people who got sold and taken across the water like it was mine, for example. And is that it? Okay.
I guess so. So how did this trip sort of translate into the novel? Did it have any influence at all?
Well, I took this trip to do research for this novel because I went to Ghana for the first time as a college student for a semester, and I went to the castle in Edina, Elmina, and I had this intense emotional reaction when I was in the dungeons, and I just felt the women calling to me. And you learn about women getting raped at these places, and that was just so horrific, to realize that some of these women, they weren't even women, they were girls, like even 13 and up, who could have gotten raped, and so that's like an extra part of the ordeal that people don't think about, and we don't often hear about women's voices of the slave trade. And so I basically applied for a Fulbright and fortunately got it, and went back for the year to do this research and try to get to know the culture and history, et cetera.
What was it like planning for a trip where you must have known there would be some kind of emotional ties or reactions and stuff like that?
I'm a very sensitive person, and doing something like this just feeds my imagination. So going to a place like Elmina, I was actually worried that what I felt in Elmina was a fluke. Mm-hmm. I felt like, okay, well, maybe if I go back, I won't feel anything. Maybe I just, the tour guide, his voice just conjured up something for me that I just broke down into tears like that. But Elmina has remained like, even the last time I went there 6 years ago, I'm like, get me out of this dungeon, because even there's a smell there. It's from bats. It's from bat waste, but the smell is so thick and intense and foul. And then you look at these dungeons, which are mildewed and creepy, and thinking about what happened there, it's just like I can't even stay in that physical space. But yet, I went to about 16 of these forts that are still standing. There's 2 that basically get all the attention, Cape Coast and Elmina, but there's 16 at least that are still standing that I visited. And I had different reactions in every single one. Some I went in and felt exactly nothing, and others I just broke down into tears and couldn't explain why am I crying right now.
And what was it like, I'm curious, as an American going to Ghana, did you feel like a culture shock at all?
You'll have to read the memoir. I wrote the memoir to answer questions like that. It's so complicated. It's so complicated because being someone who is a descendant of slaves, and not knowing where in Africa they came from, they could have come from someplace in Ghana, but there's no way of telling, But being a descendant of slaves and going to Ghana where they're not necessarily educated about American history like we aren't educated about African history. And so I would say the majority of Ghanaians I talked to, for example, had no clue that segregation happened in this country. Because they would tell me things like, oh, why do you people, meaning you Black Americans, why do you people come here and keep crying and going to these castles and cry, cry, cry? That happened so long ago. Why don't you just move on and forget it? And I want to strangle someone, literally. And, and then I would say, well, do you know about Jim Crow? What's that? Well, you know about apartheid in South Africa? Oh, yeah. Did you know that we had the same thing in the United States? What? Oh, what? Why didn't anyone tell me that? Well, you got educated about England probably more than you did about Ghana, but that's a whole other story. But they just aren't educated about that history. So, and they also would say things like, you should be lucky. You should be glad that your ancestors were put on a boat. I kid you not. How many people said this to me? That they got put on a boat because you ended up in the best country in the world. America is one step from heaven. Because the thing is, they know it's expensive to get to Ghana, but they don't know sacrifices that people are making to buy that expensive plane ticket. Not every American who's going there is wealthy. And the fact that your dollar weighs so much more when you go there, and even just trying to explain to people what you can get for $1 in the States, it's like nothing, compared to what you can get in Ghana. So they get all these misinterpretations, and they see the Cosbys, and they see American soap operas and think everyone lives like Santa Barbara, and there's no mosquitoes in America, there's no dirt in America. It's like, the old immigration, kind of story, like the streets are paved with gold. And so they're like, what are you guys complaining about? But when you tell them about that history, then they start to understand, like, oh, this is why you're still crying, and this is why you come back to these places and, remember these places like, like maybe a Jew would go to the concentration camps because this is part of that history. It's a painful thing, but it's almost like, a pilgrimage of sorts to remember and, pay homage to these people.
All right, well, thank you so much. Can you remind us the title of your piece in the book?
It's called The Slave Route.
Okay, thank you.